As we consider Black and particularly Black liberation theology today, I'd like to start in an odd place, my story. Now, if that's a terrible idea, and it very well may be, at least I'm taking my cues from the Black church tradition, which values deeply the sharing of testimonies in places like this. So I want to tell a bit of my story. I grew up in Northwest Iowa. Though I spent a few years in Florida and Texas as a young adult, most of my life has been lived in spaces that are not very diverse. Or to put it more accurately, I've lived in white-dominated spaces. Now, I suspect I'm not alone in that regard in a room like this. Following my college years and feeling a call to ministry of some sort, but really I wanted to be an academic, I found an institution that I was sure could make me a scholar, and if it happened by chance, might teach me a thing or two about being a pastor as well, as a backup plan if I needed one. So I applied to Duke University's Divinity School. In 2010, I began a 3-year master's program that's required in our denomination to be a pastor, but really, in my mind at that point, it was a good step on the path toward a doctoral program. And in the second of those 3 years, I was required to take a class that all Masters of Divinity students at Duke were required to take. It was a fairly blandly titled or generically titled course, Black Church Studies. I had the privilege of having Professor J. Cameron Carter for what would be the absolute best course that I took in 3 years at that institution. But I did not start with excitement, at least not excitement alone. In fact, I was fairly conflicted as I was preparing to take that course. I figured it would indeed be interesting subject matter, but I also knew that if I did not continue on the academic path, I was probably coming back to Iowa to serve churches. Why did I need this class? Nonetheless, it was required, so I didn't need to think too deeply on the matter. I just had to do what I had to do. As the course began, we read scholars with different visions of the Black church at that time. We read narratives from people who had been taken from home, put on ships to be enslaved in this country. We read W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass, and we read some traditional theological texts from early church writers and Eurocentric theologians. The short of it is we read a lot in this class. But it was one particular book that forced me into a moment of reckoning. James Cone's book, Black Theology and Black Power. Now, Cone was a theologian of vast importance. He was educated at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, as some of the clergy in this room. Yeah, a little shout out to Garrett. With the writing of this book, this is the 50th anniversary, but originally it came out in 1969, Black Theology and Black Power, through the writing of it, Cone became known as the father of Black theology. In short, he's a pretty big deal. But for me, he was the creator of a moment of crisis. Now, in this book, Cone was trying to make sense of theology in light of the historical moment where he lived, of the vast and profound social change in the 1960s. And especially, he was dealing with his own experience in relationship to the Black Power movement. Now, this book came out of his own crisis. And his crisis began as he was reading he was reading Malcolm X. And in the preface to his 1989 edition to this book, I want to read just a bit of his crisis and what called him to attention. Cone writes, "It was the challenging and angry voice of Malcolm X that shook me out of my theological complacency. Christianity is the white man's religion," he proclaimed again and again, as he urged African Americans to adopt a perspective on God that was derived from their own cultural history. He argued, quoting Malcolm X, "Brothers and sisters, the white man has brainwashed us black people to fasten our gaze upon a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. We're worshiping a Jesus that doesn't even look like us. Oh yes, now just think of this. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed white man has taught you and me to worship a white Jesus, to shout and sing and pray to this God that's his God, the white man's God. The white man has taught us to shout and sing and pray until we die, to wait until death for some dreamy heaven in the hereafter when we're dead. While this white man has his milk and honey in the streets paved with golden dollars here on this earth." As Cone then states, his thesis for this book then is that black power, even in its most radical expressions, is not, as it had been said in that time, the antithesis of Christianity. It is rather Christ's central message to 20th century America. And unless, continuing the quote, the denominational church makes a determined effort to recapture the man Jesus through a total identification with the suffering poor as expressed in black power, that church will become exactly what Christ is not. He continues by saying, "This work then is written with a definite attitude, the attitude of an angry black man, disgusted with the oppression of black people in America, and with a scholarly demand to be objective about it." Now, if you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable in this moment, I was with you as I was reading this for this course. But it became most troubling for me, the one who wanted to be an academic and maybe a pastor, when I read what he wrote here in his 1989 preface. As in 1969, I unfortunately still see today that most white and black churches alike have lost their way, enslaved to their own bureaucracies, with clergy and staff attending endless meetings and professional theologians reading learned papers to each other, seemingly for the exclusive purpose of advancing their professional careers. In view of the silence of the great majority of white theologians when faced with the reality of slavery and segregation, the white church's preoccupation with academic issues in theology, and their avoidance to the issue of justice, especially in the area of race, do not surprise me. Reading things like that challenged me. And I was being confronted with a starting point and an experience that was profoundly different than my own. And Cone was helping me to start seeing that there are complex structures at play in the world, structures that have served me very, very well, and yet have done a great deal of harm to countless other people. Now, it doesn't come naturally in our world to notice the songs of those who suffer. But for people of faith, it is crucial that we listen in. For Moses, as we've heard today, it took a burning bush on holy ground for him to hear that God is attentive to the suffering of God's children. In Exodus 3, God's actions there beg our attention. God said, and I'll reread these, "I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them and to bring them up out of that land." Now, the fact of the matter is in my own experience, I didn't have to reckon with suffering and injustice when I was trying to make sense of my early theology. I could get by without even paying attention at all. My experience didn't require it. I could spiritualize Exodus chapter 3 all day long. But sitting in this class, reading Cone, he just wouldn't let me off the hook. The time that I was at Duke, Cone published another book, this one called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And in this book, he got right to the heart of the matter. And I really couldn't look away at this point. He wrote this in the introduction. The cross and the lynching tree are separated by nearly 2,000 years. One is the universal symbol of Christian faith. The other is the quintessential symbol of Black oppression in America. Though both are symbols of death, one represents a message of hope and salvation, while the other signifies the negation of that message by white supremacy. Despite the obvious similarities between Jesus' death on a cross and the death of thousands of Black men and women strung up to die on a lamppost or tree, relatively few people, apart from Black poets, novelists, and other reality-seeing artists, have explored the symbolic connections. Yet I believe, Cone continues, this is the challenge that we must face. What is at stake is the credibility and the promise of the Christian gospel, and the hope that we may heal the wounds of racial violence that continue to divide our churches and our society. That season of life was the start of a transformation in my life. As I said, I want to testify today. I would even claim it was a moment of conversion for me, a time of shifting to attentiveness to the God who cares about oppressed people, and a conversion towards those who suffer at the hands of oppression. And I was taken out of the center of the story. And I started to see how the generic kind of theology that I had grown up with that served me so well, and it's churches that I attended where there was that white Jesus on the wall of every last one of them, that faith had too little to say about suffering in the world. Much of the foundation of the faith that I had and what it was built upon had little to do with the God of Moses, the God of Jesus. In the Exodus story, we hear God is serious about those who suffer. And as with liberation theologies across the world, Black theology in this country is calling all of us to join in some justice songs. So in that moment of conversion back at Duke, I started to pay attention. But as we Methodists say, what begins in justification needs to continue in the work of sanctification, of being continually transformed. I started to pay attention, but there was plenty I still did not notice. I still didn't connect what I was learning in the classroom in those beautiful Gothic spaces to the almost all Black custodial staff who cleaned them up afterwards, who only a few years after I graduated and moved back to Iowa led a movement for workers' rights on campus because their wages were pitiful. And I didn't notice the other signs that were baked into that complicated Southern institution I was attending. Shortly after I graduated, two professors who were doing groundbreaking work at Duke in Black theology left. In fact, while they were there, the Christian Century called J. Cameron Carter and Willie Jennings two of the founders of the new Black theology. In fact, Carter, my professor, Willie Jennings, who's now teaching at Yale, both left just shortly after my time there. Another black professor who took one of their places, who followed them, left abruptly, calling Duke Divinity School the plantation. Jennings has since written a book addressing the matter. I wasn't paying enough attention yet to notice all of that. But when I think back at this time, the signs were there. When Moses met the holy God on that hallowed ground, he learned just how serious God is about liberation. And the Exodus narrative is still central to our faith. And any faith that is going to be faithful must reckon with the places of suffering in this world. And our answers must sound like freedom in this life, not simply some escape into the next one. Now, I'm incredibly grateful for all of you. No matter how you're feeling about me in this moment, I really love you all. And I love this church. In fact, one of the reasons, I don't know if you know this, but when Pastor Sherry announced that she was retiring, I asked, really trying to be persuasive and diligently, can I please stay? One of the reasons I asked for that is because of the missional priorities that we were identifying in that same season, in those same months. I was so energized and excited when you told our listening team through that listening campaign that identified those priorities that you want to do something about injustice in the world. A number of you said, it was relayed to me, and I heard some of you say it, we're tired of empty talk about justice. Talk is cheap. I love that about this place, because that sort of thing is rare in spaces like this. White churches and white clergy who serve them are masters at maintaining our comfort. And it is risky business to call out injustice and to name systems that harm people because, quite frankly, they serve us well. So I'm told in not so subtle ways, just play a tired old song and dance. Just assure me I'm going to heaven and don't sound too political in the process. But that is a head in the sand kind of song. And our God is a God who hears justice songs. The one who sings, "How long, O Lord?" is the one who draws God's ear and God's attention. Now, indeed, the true test of our missional priority to resist injustice by doing the work of justice is ultimately action. But today I'm only asking us to be courageous enough to pay attention, to notice. Now, you may not believe it, but I've been really easy on you all so far. No, honest, I have. I've told my story, and I've talked about a divinity school in North Carolina where they've got their own history. But this isn't about that. That was all the setup for this question. Will we pay attention here? Will we turn aside and join Moses at a burning bush so we can hear again what catches God's attention? What does God care about? Will we observe the misery? Will we hear the cries? Will we know the sufferings so that we can rise up to join the God of liberation in Exodus kind of work in our own time? It isn't just about ancient Egypt. It isn't just about what happened in the southern states in this country. In a 2-mile radius of this building that many of us are sitting in, The median income of black families is $43,461. If you cut that radius from 2 miles down to half a mile around where many of us are in this moment, that number goes down to $17,000, $17,303. Well, we have the courage to notice that in our public schools last year, 59% of the charges against students were against black students, even though they make up less than 20% of the student population. In the litany of pipelines that we don't need running through our state, can we agree that the school-to-prison pipeline is one that has no place here? Can we resist the urge to look away? When Ann Harris Carter in the Office of Health Equity at Lynn County Public Health tells us that racism is a public health crisis. Justice songs begin in God's ears when those who suffer sing the blues. And the God of justice is still looking for someone who's paying enough attention to join in some freedom songs. Will you sing?